And the verdict is in on the federal gun charges against Hunter Biden. The jury has found him guilty on all 3 felony counts. This is the first time the immediate family member of a sitting president has been convicted. The federal jury in Delaware concluded that he violated laws meant to prevent drug addicts from owning firearms. The verdict comes after just 3 hours of deliberation and emotional testimony about his drug use from his ex-wife and sister-in-law. The younger Biden now faces up to 25 years in prison and a fine of up to $750,000, although it is unlikely he will receive the maximum sentence since he is a first-time offender. The judge says sentencing usually happens 120 days after the verdict, which means sentencing could take place in mid-October, just before Election Day. Hunter Biden still faces yet another federal trial in California for allegedly failing to pay 4 years' worth of taxes totaling at least $1.4 million. That trial is set to start in September. And hours after Hunter Biden is convicted on gun charges, President Biden speaking on gun restriction measures at a previously scheduled event in Washington. And tomorrow, the president is set to leave for Italy to attend the G7 summit. NTD's Iris Tao has more from Bari, Italy.
And President Biden addressing survivors from gun-related violence highlights his administration's work on gun control.
Whether we're Democrats or Republicans, we want our families to be safe. We all want to drop them off at a house of worship, a mall, a movie theater, a school, without worrying it's the last time I'm going to get to see them.
The speech comes just hours after his son Hunter Biden was found guilty on gun charges. Biden did not address the verdict in the speech, but issued a statement earlier today saying he will accept the outcome of this case and that he's proud of his son for his recovery from addiction. Last week, Biden said he would not pardon his son if he's found guilty. Biden's Tuesday speech on guns was previously scheduled, and it comes as Biden's campaign is ramping up its messaging on the issue to target Biden's 2024 rival.
And by doing nothing, he made the situation considerably worse.
Former President Trump has vowed to roll back Biden's gun rules, saying,
"But the Second Amendment will be, it's under siege. But with me, they never get anywhere."
And Trump's campaign on Tuesday linked Hunter's conviction to Biden's presidency. After Hunter's conviction, Biden changed his schedule and returned to Delaware. He's still set to fly out on Wednesday to Italy for the G7 summit. The White House told us that Biden will talk with G7 leaders about democracy, ally support for Ukraine, and China's support for Russia. Reporting from Bari, Italy, Iris Tao, NTD News.
So how might Hunter Biden's guilty verdict affect the broader discussion over the Second Amendment? And how are some Republican lawmakers responding to the verdict? This as the U.S. Supreme Court is expected to rule on a gun rights case this month. Joining me now to assess the verdict and its implications is Michael McCoy, the director of the Center to Keep and Bear Arms at the Mountain States Legal Foundation. Mike McCoy, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you, Mike. If you could, let's start off and discuss the significance of the trial of the president's son and how the judge's rejection of that initial plea deal got us to this point.
Sure. So if you recall, last summer, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware had formulated a plea agreement with the defendant, with Hunter Biden, that would have had him pleading to 2 misdemeanor tax charges and have these gun charges kind of held in abeyance while he went through a 2-year diversion period. If he had kept his nose clean, literally, during that 2-year period of time, those gun charges would have gone away. And so he would not be where he is today, having been convicted of all 3 of those gun-related charges and potentially facing time in prison, although in reality, I don't think a prison term is likely to be imposed in this case.
Mike, there's been a lot of discussion as to whether or not these charges should have been brought anyways, that it's not really that common to bring such charges. But the fact that they did, what might the jury's quick decision indicate about the strength of the evidence presented?
Well, I think it indicates that the prosecution really laid out a very solid case. They had excellent witnesses who provided the facts and the information needed to establish the elements of the crime. They had corroboration of that witness testimony, and probably the best corroboration of it was the defendant's own words himself, spoken in his audiobook of his memoir that he wrote, Beautiful Things. And so you have the defendant himself implicating himself as a drug addict, as a drug user, at and near the time that he was purchasing this firearm. But on top of that, you also had witness after witness, text message after text message, video evidence, audio evidence, all of it establishing the elements of the crime. And really, it's not surprising to me that the jury took only 3 hours to reach this verdict, because it was a pretty solid case presented by the prosecution.
Now, Mike, let's discuss the appeals process. They've already announced, Hunter and his team, that they're going to appeal. The NRA, historically, obviously Republican, will be inserting themselves into this appeal process in some form. How is the appeal ultimately maybe going to bring together the defense and the pro-Second Amendment National Rifle Association?
Well, I think the saying is politics makes strange bedfellows. And so the Hunter Biden, the president's son, and the NRA coming together on the appeal would be unusual, obviously. But understandable when you consider the fact that there are many in this country who have mixed feelings about restrictions like this that prevent people who are drug addicts, for example, or felons, or people who have been convicted of domestic violence of possessing a firearm, exercising their Second Amendment rights. I have my own personal opinions on that. As a prosecutor for 20 years, I can say that I did prosecute felons for possessing a firearm. But in every case that I did that, it was in connection with another underlying crime. Typically, it would be drug trafficking or domestic violence or something along those lines. It is unusual to have this be a standalone crime in the sense that that's all that he's being charged with, which is possessing a firearm as an addict, as a user of illegal narcotics. But it's not unprecedented. And regardless of how you feel about the crime or the law, it is the law in the books currently. And so the prosecution was able to establish the facts and the elements of that crime very well. The jury agreed with the prosecution's assessment and returned a guilty verdict. On appeal, there's always going to be an appeal in a case like this. I don't see anything that would make it likely that this verdict is going to be overturned. The judge has been very careful in their rulings. The prosecutor's been very careful in how they presented evidence. Even if the appellate court finds that there was some error somewhere or sometime during the trial, I would predict that the court would conclude that that was what we call harmless error, meaning, yes, there was error, but it wouldn't have changed the outcome of the case or the trial. So therefore, they're not going to overturn the verdict in this case.
Now, Mike, President Biden has stated that he will accept the case's outcome and respect the judicial process. Is this the right position, both politically and otherwise, in your opinion?
I think so. It would be hypocritical of him to support the decision that came out of New York 10 days ago, or whenever that was, 2 weeks ago now, and not support the criminal justice system in regards to this particular case. And so he was kind of backed into a corner on this one, where there's only one way he can conclude, which is the system worked. Even though obviously it didn't necessarily work for his son personally, or for him as the father of that individual. But the fact of the matter is that the system worked. Evidence was presented. The jury had an opportunity to deliberate and came back with a verdict in this case. He doesn't like the verdict, I'm sure, but he's politically savvy enough, or at least his advisors are, to tell him, don't convey that publicly and support the verdict, at least publicly.
Mike, just lastly, Hunter's not quite out of the woods yet. He has another pretty serious trial coming up out in California over tax evasion. Could the outcome of this trial influence that upcoming tax case? And just talk to us about the seriousness of that case.
Yeah, that's a very serious case. It involves over $1.4 million in unreported taxes, and those are felony charges as well. That was the other component of this plea deal that fell apart. And so that's a problem for Hunter. As far as its direct impact on this trial, it's not likely to have any direct impact. The evidence of his possession of a firearm as an addict is not going to be admitted during the trial on his tax charges. The jury is not going to be informed of it, at least officially, during the trial proceedings. Now, whether or not the jurors are aware of it when getting picked for that case, whether or not they show up with that knowledge in the back of their heads, they're going to be instructed by the judge that that should not influence whether or not they find him guilty or not guilty of these tax-related charges. But nevertheless, it's out there, right? And so because of that, you can never really wash a juror of all their biases or all their preconceived notions of a particular defendant. And in this case, the fact that he is convicted of this crime is something probably the jurors on that tax case are going to bring to the jury box with them. But the court will be very careful and very explicit in telling them, do not consider that evidence when it comes to making a decision on this case, whether the defendant is guilty or not guilty.
Mike McCoy, really appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hamas accepting a ceasefire proposal this 2 weeks after President Biden announced it. This comes as Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East, calling on world leaders to put pressure on Hamas. NTD's Jack Bradley has more from the U.S. State Department.
The announcement that Hamas accepted the ceasefire proposal came just hours after Secretary of State Antony Blinken called on leaders in the Middle East to put pressure on Hamas. This is Blinken's 8th time in the Middle East since the Israel-Hamas war began in October. He met with leaders from Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority. He reiterated on Tuesday that Israel is on board with the ceasefire proposal that will lead to the release of hostages.
When I met Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday in Israel, he reaffirmed his support and his commitment to bringing this proposal across the finish line.
Blinken also announced the U.S.'s largest contribution to the Palestinian people in humanitarian aid. Over $400 million will be sent to the Palestinians in Gaza. This brings the total amount of U.S. assistance to the Palestinians since the war began to over $670 million. It will be used to provide displaced Palestinians with food, water, health care, and education. And while in Israel, Blinken spoke to the families of hostages that were protesting in Tel Aviv on Tuesday.
Blinken came, he's been here multiple times, he shook our hand, he spoke to us, he reassured us that they're doing everything possible. And our message to him was that we have to bring home every single hostage. That this is an issue of all of our family members who are alive and who are not, and we need every single one of them home. And he promised that that's what he's working on in his government and with the Israeli government.
Blinken's visit comes as there's 5 Americans among the remaining 120 hostages still held captive by the Hamas terrorists in Gaza. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.